Good evening, and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Myron Belkine, treasurer of the club and chair of its International Correspondence Committee, which has organized this evening's event. Tonight, you might say, is the culmination of a 5-year-long campaign by our committee to fulfill a mission of enhancing the international activities and events at the National Press Club. For the first time ever, the response has been so great that we arranged an overflow room to accommodate everyone, and we thank all of you for coming. We are truly appreciative for you coming together for the largest ever event organized by our committee under these circumstances. The credit for this evening goes to Jan DePlane, a member of our committee, who proposed that we have a marquee event on Islam pegged to the publication of the book Religion, Terror, and Error, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement by Douglas Johnston, the president and founder of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. As many of you know, whenever Jan has a proposal, it is difficult to say no to the idea or to her. And once again, Jan, I'm glad I listened to you. Where are you, Jan? Our thanks. Our first goal was to have an outstanding moderator of a very distinguished panel. And our first and only choice was Sally Quinn, who herself, as you know, is a very distinguished Washington Post journalist and author, who 5 years ago founded the On Faith blog at the Washington Post, based on the premise, in her words, that religion is the most pervasive yet least understood topic in global life. How appropriate it is that our discussion tonight will focus on how religious considerations and faith-based diplomacy can contribute to the solution of conflicts around the world, and how timely it is that we are meeting exactly 24 hours after President Barack Obama delivered a major policy speech related to the U.S. role in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thank you again for coming. I would like to call first on Douglas Johnston, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past month as we met and planned this event. Doug on Monday said, Myron, we're going to make history at the National Press Club with this event. And because of the timeliness of it and the content of it, and being an objective journalist, I have to say I agree with his assessment. And again, the timeliness of it could not be better. And so, Doug, I would like to call on you to talk about the book, to introduce a first-time ever shown video about the Pakistan Madrasa project of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And after he finishes, I'll then introduce the other panelists one by one, and they will say a few words, and then I will ask Sally Quinn to moderate the panel discussion tonight. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Myron, to you and your committee for welcoming us into your home. And also like to thank Jan, as others have, for making this all possible, and Sally and our distinguished panelists for agreeing to participate, and all of you for coming out tonight. My hope is that this event can be a bit of a wake-up call with respect to our country's general neglect of religion and its practice of foreign policy. And it goes beyond neglect. We don't even understand some of the basics. For example, when an American says secular, the average Muslim hears godless, when what was intended was freedom to worship as you please. And the godless interpretation, one may conclude offhand that this has to do with the cultural image that we project, which often is every bit as offensive to us as it is to any Muslim. But it goes much deeper than that. It goes back to the fact that the American Revolution predated the French Revolution. When our forefathers came over to this country, they left a country in which absolute monarchy had made the transition to constitutional monarchy, and religion had survived that process. So they leaned on it rather heavily. when they conducted this American experiment. A few years later, 1789, with the French Revolution, it was a very different scene because the church, Catholic Church especially, was seen to be complicit with the monarchy and all the ills that the people were facing. And so, unlike in America with an Edmund Burke approach where you preserve the wisdom of the ages and reform at the margins, there it was more like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They threw the baby out with the bathwater and specifically purged religion to make way for secular humanism. So that's why you see this difference in understanding of what that word means. This was all driven home to me several years ago when we invited 6 top leaders from Sudan and Kashmir, both areas that we were working in at the time, to the National Prayer Breakfast. And 5 of those 6 were Muslims. And after the breakfast and the 2 days of activity surrounding it, they all remarked on how absolutely surprised they were to see the degree to which religious faith underpins our democratic processes. And they said that they felt much closer as a result. So it seems supremely ironic that here we are, one of the most religious countries on the face of the planet, and yet we are so at sea and unable to deal with the religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape. And there are several reasons for this. First is the fact that we've allowed ourselves to use our separation of church and state as an excuse for not doing our homework to understand how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of others. Second is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making and its exclusion of religion from the policymakers' calculus. And third is the fact that all of us seem to fall into this trap of compartmentalizing our religion to the point where we're almost embarrassed to talk about it in the workplace. Indeed, whenever industry or government hears the very word religion, they run for the hills for fear of being accused of favoring one faith tradition over another. So it was in recognition of all this that I wrote this book. And the book, in many respects, is a how-to book. It's how to incorporate religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. How to move beyond the rational actor model of decision-making to a process that accommodates non-state actors and non-rational factors like religion. And it's also a how-to book to move to a new leadership paradigm that will serve the United States better in the multipolar world that awaits us. The opportunities for going it alone are fast disappearing. In the course of all that, we lay out a strategy for how the U.S. can deal more effectively with the causal factors underlying religious extremism. Most of what we've done to date has been about addressing symptoms, and we just need desperately to come to grips with cause. Well, here what we do is we take a hard look at existing assets that we have to see which of them could be usefully redirected to help deal with this problem, and then to look at whatever new capabilities might be required to bridge the remaining gap. Now, foremost among existing assets is the American Muslim community, which can play a very important role in informing our foreign policy and public diplomacy with a more nuanced understanding of Islam, so that we don't end up on the wrong side of the law of unintended consequences quite so much. They can also help bridge relations with other Muslim communities overseas, many of them in areas of strategic consequence to the United States. The second capability are our military chaplains, who already bridge church and state and have many of the skills of dealing with different religions. But with additional training and with expanded rules of engagement, by forming relationships of trust with local religious leaders overseas, they will become much better equipped to understand what's going on and how to advise their commanders on what the cultural or religious implications are of decisions that are about to be taken. And finally, there's the NGO community, of which we are a part, non-governmental organizations. NGOs enjoy a flexible, apolitical posture that's can be very, very helpful, particularly in dealing with the transnational aspects of the threats that we face. Amongst new capabilities that are required, first is realigning the executive branch. And here we offer 4 different organizational structures for the State Department that would enable them to be dealing with religion in the natural course of doing business every day. Fundamental to all of those structures is the establishment of a new position called religion attaché. Now, this would be someone who's been trained probably with a theological background and others, but who understand the nuances and who can deal with the complexities of many of these religious issues that most other folks can't deal with. And the naysayers will tell you by establishing such a position, that's the quickest way to marginalize it and the function that it represents. And I disagree with that strongly. I believe if you were to place these people in the political section of our embassies and you gave them comparable status and responsibilities as we do our political military officers, these political religious officers could start having an impact and an influence on our decisions quite quickly. Second would be the fact that we need to address the political ambiguities surrounding the separation of church and state. There's a whole chapter devoted to that. There's a whole chapter devoted to each one of these things that I'm talking about. But there, the answer is quite simple, straightforward. The President of the United States just needs to turn to his Justice Department and says, make the legal case for us to use religious engagement as a component of our foreign policy. And then it would be very helpful to get endorsement of both houses of Congress. But that's readily done. And if we did that, that would enable our political leaders and military leaders who feel intimidated by these political ambiguities from taking the kinds of actions needed to deal with the religious dimensions of the threats that they're facing. Thirdly, we need an effective conflict prevention capability. And here the book suggests that the formation of conflict prevention research teams that would go into areas, trouble spots before things have heated up, assess very carefully what needs to be done, come back with policy prescriptions, and help us to enable us to nip these things in the bud before they turn into conflict. The ounce of prevention is worth many pounds of gain. So finally, we need to support what we call a process of organic suasion, which suggests change and healing from within. And implicit in this is the fact that one would have to believe that within Islamic traditions and sacred texts, that one can find the wherewithal to counter illegitimate warfare being conducted in its name. And probably one of the better examples of this business of organic suasion is a project that we've been doing that you heard made earlier, and that's reforming the madrasas in Pakistan, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. Now, for 7 years, we've been on the ground there trying to deal with these madrasa leaders and to turn things around. Few of us in the West, however, understand the illustrious history of these schools. If you read the media, all you get is that these are seedbeds of terrorism. Well, once upon a time, in the Middle Ages through the 16th century, they were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. It was only European exposure to them that gave birth to our own university system. And you would be stunned at how many of the traditions and mores of academe trace their roots back to the madrasas, starting with the mortarboards and tassels you wear at graduation. So they've enjoyed this great history, this time in the sun, but then under the impact of British colonialism, they feared for the loss of their Muslim identity. So they sought to purge themselves of all subjects that were either secular or Western in nature, to the point where the majority of them today are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Now, our goals have been twofold. First is to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences with a heavy emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. We don't pretend to touch the religious core. That would be far too sensitive. But our assumption is if we do a good job in both of these areas, this can smooth a lot of the rough edges. And all of the evidence that we've seen suggests that that's a valid assumption. Second, probably more important goal, is to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills amongst the students. When we first began, if a student so much as raised his hand in class, he was punished for disrespect. And why this is so important is you'll find these youngsters as young as the age of 12 who've memorized the Quran from cover to cover, and they're essentially clueless as to what it means because they've had to memorize it in Arabic, and their first language is Urdu. But along comes the local militant who misappropriates a little scripture, as all religions are guilty of doing from time to time, to recruit these kids to their cause. And these children have absolutely no ability to question or to challenge. They just go do as they're asked. So this is why it's so very important. Thus far, at this point, after 7 years, we've engaged a little over 2,700 madrasa leaders from about 1,633 madrasas. That is, some would look at that and say, well, that's pretty impressive. It is, but it isn't. There's about 20,000 of these madrasas. But most of the ones we've dealt with have been in the radical areas, so we really feel we have sufficient momentum to take this to scale across the country. And securing the resources to do that is a major challenge at this point. One can legitimately ask, why have we succeeded where all others have failed? And there's about 4 reasons for this. First is ownership. We've done this in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform project and not something imposed from the outside, which means that they have a lot of say in the change process. These are bright people, contrary to the stereotypes you'll read in the media. And I just want to take a moment to read for you the initial paragraph in our teacher awareness module, which was crafted by a madrasa leader. I quote, "I have come to a frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. My personal approach creates the climate. My daily mood makes the weather. As a teacher, I have a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it's my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized." Pretty powerful stuff. Second ingredient in the success is appealing to their own heritage, not only the heritage of their schools, which, as I said before, is illustrious, but going back in time 1,000 years ago, when many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences took place under Islam, including religious tolerance at a time when Christianity was woefully intolerant. The more they hear this and internalize it, the taller they walk, and the more they think, hey, maybe we can do better. Thirdly, and I think most important of all, is we ground all suggested change in Islamic principles so that they can genuinely feel they're becoming better Muslims in the process, and they are. And the fourth ingredient is a posture of humility, driven by 2 things. First is our understanding of the fact that it was the United States that was principally responsible for planting the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place. We were trying to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. When that was done, we left. Many of you have seen Charlie Wilson's War. That's pretty accurate. And now we're back, and they're doing what we trained them to do. They just changed targets. So this is, again, the law of unintended consequences. But the other aspect of the humility is if you think about Proverbs 18, verse 13, which says, "Only a fool judges a matter before he hears it." And what we try to do is, not just hear what they have to say, but make the effort to try to hear through their ears what we're saying, to think about that in advance. And that really serves us well. I would say, in summarizing here, that this work that's with the madrasas, as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing going on either on or off the battlefield that's any more strategic than this. This is the asymmetric counter to the asymmetric threat. It gets at the ideas behind the guns. And one short anecdote to illustrate how that happens. A little over a year ago, we were conducting a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley. And toward the end of that workshop, one of the madrasa leaders stood up, and turned out he was the commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, who are the folks that brought you the attacks on Mumbai. He says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. I came here to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but now I find myself standing here full of rage. Rage because for 26 years I've been teaching the Quran, studying it and teaching it the same way it was taught to me. He says, for the first time in my life, I feel like I've experienced the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. He says, I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. He said, I'm going to change what I tell my students, and I'm going to tell them why. And we came back a month later. Ozzy Hussain came back, our project director, and sure enough, this leader was doing exactly as he promised. We also happened to have a CNN team along. They'd been after us for 3 years to document some of our work. And he says it to CNN, for God and the whole world to hear. And it just bowled me over, because you look cross-eyed in the Swat Valley when the Taliban was in charge, and you'd lose your head. And here's a guy, I guess he got cut some slack because he was a terrorist commander, but he's still alive. But it's amazing, because we find that in working with these madrasa leaders, once you penetrate, work your way past that veneer of rage and hostility, not only do they get it, once they engage, they not only get it, but a lot of them become champions of it at great personal risk to themselves. So at this point, what I'd like to do is show you a 4-minute video that will sort of give you a hands-on feel for how this process of organic suasion can actually work in some of the most difficult of circumstances. So if we could have the video, please.
लेकिन बदकिस्मती थी इस्लाम में इसकी कहीं इजाज़त नहीं है.
Why should a child say yes, why not no to militancy?
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह, ये पहले ये था कि हम तो एक रूह पर देता था, एक रूह पर देख रहा था, उसके आगे पीछे उसका पसपर्दा, उसका बात तोलने का हमें न मौका मिलता था, न हम ये गवारा करते थे कि उसका बात तोले. चेंज, तब्दीली उस वक्त से आई कि मैंने पहला वर्कशॉप अज़हर साहब की क़ियादत में, उसकी रहनुमाई में, उसकी लेक्चर में हमने वहाँ शमूलियत की.
क्योंकि एक होता है क्रिटिसिज्म, तनकीद, और या फीडबैक, जिसे कहते हैं हम लोग कभी कभी एक दूसरे को फीडबैक देना, और दूसरा होता है क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग, है ना. क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग उस चीज़ों को तोड़ फोड़ कर सोचना. अल्लाह मियाँ ने तो तनकीदी सोच बचपन में बच्चे के अंदर डाली होती है. वो हमारा एक बहुत अच्छा माशाल्लाह से करतूत है बड़ों का, जो कि हम उसको ख़त्म कर देते हैं. पता है कैसे? एक ज़माना ऐसा आता है कि बच्चे की एक ऐसी उम्र होती है जिसमें वो हर चीज़ में पूछता है ये क्यों नहीं, ये क्यों, ये लाइट इतनी ब्राइट क्यों होती है, ये ग्रास इतनी ग्रीन क्यों होती है. डिपेंड ये करता है कि तनकीदी सोच को उभारना वहाँ से शुरू हो जाएगा. इसीलिए तो आपको बाप बनाया है. बल्कि बहुत ज़्यादा लोग डेफिनेशन जो इल्म की करते हैं वो यही कहते हैं कि एबिलिटी टू आस्क क्वेश्चंस.
ये तो हम जो सोचते हैं कि ये कि अमेरिका के एजेंडे के लिए काम कर रहा है यहूद, इसमें कितना अमेरिका के एजेंटी का किरदार इससे साबित हो रहा है, जिस पर सोचें. ये तो दीन इस्लाम के लिए, मुसलमानों पर जो ब्लेम है, मुसलमानों पर जो दाग है, उनकी मिटाने के लिए. और ये तो मुसलमानों की क्रेडिट में ये बात जा रही है. आप लोग ये कहता है, ये करता है, जितने आप लोगों के ज़हन में है दहशतगर्दी के बारे में, इंतहा पसंदी के बारे में, सब इसके आप सब मुसलमान लोग ठहराते हैं। तो ये जब आपसे ये सुना ना तो मेरे जहन में थोड़ा पराखदिली पैदा होगी।
There are so many ways that Haji Ayub has changed that surprised us as well, especially me.
मैंने अमेरिका में जब देखा अल-फातिहा का जब हमने विज़िट किया तो वहाँ पर जब मैंने देखा तो मैं आप यकीन करें मेरे आंसू में मेरे आंखों में आंसू आ गए। वहाँ अमेरिका में तो लोगों ने उनसे वो अक्ल नहीं छीना कि आप अल-फातिहा में क्या कर रहे हैं। तो मैं लुत्फ़ अंदोज़ भी हुआ और एहसास भी हुआ कि काश जैसा हमारे मुल्क में भी हो, ऐसे इदारे हमारे मुसलमान हैं वो बेस्ट मुसलमान हैं, अपनी मुसलमानी पर कायम हैं, लेकिन कोई उसको तंग नहीं करता है। लेकिन यहाँ के हालात कुछ और है, काफ़ी डिफरेंस है। यहाँ पर कॉलेज में जो लोग पढ़ते हैं ना तो वो मदरसे के लोगों को अकारत की निगाह से देखते हैं, और यहाँ पर मदरसे में जो लोग पढ़ते हैं ना तो उनके लिए जो कॉलेज के जो लोग हैं ना उनकी निगाह में वो भी कुछ नहीं है।
And he decided to build a whole school named after Al-Fateh Academy in Virginia and follow the similar model of that school.
I'd like to ask our star of stage and screen, Azhar Hussain Azi, who's our Senior Vice President for Preventive Diplomacy and the Director of our Pakistan project, to please stand so we can give him the recognition his due. In conclusion, I would just like to read a couple of paragraphs from the conclusion of the book. You know, the whole book is about change, and change is never easy, as we are reminded by Niccolo Machiavelli some 5 centuries ago. I quote, "It ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. Confirming the above and indicative of the inertia to be overcome is the following observation by a conservative commentator in response to recent attempts by the United States to reach out to regimes that were previously deemed off limits. I quote, "The world is in fact a dangerous place, inhabited by fundamentalist regimes, crusading radicals, and amoral power seekers. Realism would dictate that we be pessimists and cynics, never trusting until verified, basing our foreign policy on the past actions of our opponents and not on their sweet words or our even sweeter hopes. Well, history suggests the need to heed such advice and above all to proceed with our eyes open. It does not, however, negate the fact that the world is changing and that we need to anticipate that change by making the necessary adjustments to our prospective role and leadership style. For a new paradigm to be accepted, it needs only to be provably better than its predecessor. There is no requirement that it explain all of the facts or situations with which it is confronted, only that it does a better job of predicting and responding to them than any of its competitors. Crisis often proliferates new discovery, and it's typically the failure of existing rules, think rational actor, that leads to a search for new ones. Because the stakes are so extraordinarily high in today's interconnected world, we can neither afford the crisis nor the failure of rules as a prerequisite to making the necessary change. The time has come. The future is now." Thank you very much.
My personal pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ambassador James K. Glassman, who is the founding executive director of the George W. Bush Institute and moderator of Ideas in Action, a weekly series on public policy issues aired on more than 100 public television stations around the country. Mr. Glassman has had an active career in politics and as a journalist and publisher. He served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from June 2008 to January 2009, leading the government-wide international strategic communications effort. And it was during that time that I was fortunate to be invited to a reception and dinner at the Indonesian ambassador's residence. And it was the first time I heard Mr. Glassman speak. And I really, even speaking objectively, I was so impressed by his communication skills and his content and his delivery. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, James, you must have put a lot of preparation into that speech. And he said, Myron, I didn't know I was going to speak until I was asked to stand up and say a few words. And I said, wow, I want you to come and be a guest of honor at one of the signature lunches of the National Press Club. And a few months later, he did so, and he made an excellent impression in the way he delivered a meaningful speech and handled the most difficult part of the Press Club lunches, which is the Q&A. Ambassador Glassman, it's my pleasure for the second time to welcome you to the National Press Club and to also welcome Mrs. Glassman.
Thanks, Myron. Thank you, Myron. I don't know if I like that kind of build-up. You know, when you're Undersecretary of State, people come to visit you a lot. They have ideas. In some cases, they're looking for money. In some cases, they simply want you to get behind their ideas. And never during my short but quite intense tenure at the State Department was I presented with a more compelling idea, and not just an idea, but a real live program that was making change than what Doug and Ozzie brought to me and to others at the State Department regarding the Madrasa project. This is a very modest man over here, but he is truly an exceptional man. A leader in the U.S. Navy, spent a lot of time on submarines, and he writes in this book, as he began to spend time and think, as I'm sure you have plenty of time to do when you're on a submarine, I came to believe that if mankind is to have any hope of realizing its full potential, it will need to develop better ways to resolve its differences. I began to devote time and energy to this theme. As a Christian inspired by the challenge to be a peacemaker, I became convinced that although religious principles and matters of faith are all too often co-opted by power politics to aid and abet conflict, these same principles, if properly applied, could actually play a key role in its prevention and resolution. And this is Doug Johnston's big idea, and it's a very important idea, and it's reflected in this book. It's a provocative book, it's an inspiring book, and it is an extremely rich book. I mean, every page is packed with interesting ideas and facts. And so I'm honored that Doug has asked me to share a few comments about the book today. My only complaint is that he didn't write this book earlier while I was still serving at the State Department, because I think I would have had a much keener understanding into ideas about structure, for example. I'd like to begin with a quote from departing Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Over the long term, we cannot kill or capture our way to victory. Non-military efforts, tools of persuasion and inspiration were indispensable to the outcome of the defining struggle of the 20th century. They are just as indispensable in the 21st century, perhaps even more so. And this, quite frankly, was my own guiding principle or idea. As a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs under President Bush, I spent a great deal of time thinking about such matters, and I concur with Secretary Gates. Persuasion and inspiration are absolutely essential to victory. To achieve our foreign policy goals, we need to take the tools of public diplomacy as seriously as the tools of violence. Public diplomacy is not simply a way to get people to like us better. It's a way to achieve some of the most difficult national security goals that we have. For example, helping to create a free and safe Afghanistan. And I must say that while public diplomacy has been important It was important in the Bush administration. It's important in the Obama administration. It's not as important as it should be. And I think we learn one aspect of the importance of public diplomacy in this book. And what would make more sense in this struggle than to engage the pervasive influence and impact of religion in this struggle? I immediately, when I learned about Doug's program, I immediately became a very strong supporter. I gave it as much support as I possibly could. And I agree. Doug just said, and I wrote this down, there is nothing more strategic on or off the battlefield than this madrasa program. I completely agree with that. And I think it should get more recognition and more support. So in this book, we're provided with a roadmap for pursuing religious engagement through both governmental and non-governmental channels. Spiritual engagement, as Doug defines it, can be an effective counter to violent extremism. It also represents a compelling vision for public diplomacy. So I just want to highlight briefly 4 essential ingredients of this new form of engagement that also hold true for effective public diplomacy. First, like spiritual engagement, effective public diplomacy engagement begins with respect. When I took my job, one of the things that interested me was what's the source of the animosity toward the United States? And the research shows there are 3 sources. One is that we don't explain our policies very well. Second is when we do explain them, people don't like them anyway. That is to say, they don't like a lot of our policies. And quite frankly, there's not much we can do about that. I don't think that we should change our policies to win a popularity contest. I think that our policies should be well thought through, including the public diplomacy aspects of them, but once policies are set, they ought to be pursued. But it was the third element that I thought we could actually do something about, and that was that many, especially Muslims, felt that we didn't take their views, that we didn't receive their views with respect. It wasn't just that we didn't listen to them. You hear a lot about listening, and listening is important. But it's really respect that's more important. And it's not that we would then adopt the policies that they wanted, but that we would give them a thorough hearing. They understood that ultimately we're going to make decisions that are in America's best interest. But to do it with respect is absolutely essential. So I think that's the first item, spiritual engagement, that relates spiritual engagement to diplomatic engagement. Second, the premise of spiritual engagement is that change can happen only if there is a clear understanding of the challenge. And the ICRD's work in Pakistan's madrasas has succeeded largely because of this understanding of Pakistan's unique religious, educational, and cultural character. I have to say, this is not easy. It takes time. And it's not just Americans. You know, we're frequently criticized for not understanding others' religious, educational, and cultural character. I don't think it's just us. I think it's something that takes time, and we need to respect it. Third, Doug's religious engagement, like our Fulbright exchanges, is built on empathy. It's a wonderful quote from Senator Fulbright, who created the Fulbright exchanges, which, by the way, is where the single most well-supported in financial terms program by the United States taxpayers is the Fulbright exchanges. And this is what Senator Fulbright said: the essence of intercultural education is empathy, the ability to see the world as others see it, and to allow for the possibility that others may see something that we failed to see. That was how Senator Fulbright conceived the Fulbright exchanges. And fourth, the ICRD's groundbreaking work in relating to Iran illustrates the clear untapped potential of religious dialogue as a key to effective communication. This book challenges all of us who care about diplomacy to acquire a sophisticated understanding of other worldviews and the degree to which religious values influence those views. In my written endorsement of Doug's book, I referred to it as shibboleth shattering. I can barely pronounce that. that challenges our long-held assumptions of what effective public diplomacy entails. As creative and committed as our diplomacy is, this book makes a powerful argument that we can do even better by first making religion part of the solution to intractable identity-based conflicts, second, addressing the ideas behind the guns, especially those embedded in religion, and third, moving beyond the rational actor model. You heard Doug use that phrase, of decision-making when dealing with religious imperatives. So we thank you, Doug, for opening the door to a new avenue of diplomacy, for providing us with new tools of persuasion and inspiration, as Secretary Gates put it, and for offering us a better way to deal with the religious dimensions of conflict. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Edwin Meese, who holds the Ronald Reagan Chair in Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. As I know you all know and respect, Mr. Meese has had a distinguished career as a lawyer, educator, public official, and business executive. He served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988 and held the position of Counselor to the President, where he functioned as Ronald Reagan's Chief Policy Advisor from 1981 to 1985. Mr. Meese, we're very pleased to welcome you to the National Press Club, and we thank you.
It's a great pleasure for me to join my colleagues here and join all of you in this examination of Doug's book and also the great work that he's doing. A military commander or a political leader knows that in dealing with difficult challenges, you have to use every possible means of meeting those challenges. And in dealing with the subject of terror, this means that we have to combine military, diplomatic, political, economic, and indeed cultural resources in contending with what I consider today one of the greatest threats to our country and to people in a peaceful world that we've seen in a long, long time. And so I would like to talk about one aspect that Doug mentioned in his remarks, and that is why religion is so often excluded as one of the resources that we use in meeting these challenges. And as he pointed out, it is a misunderstanding of the idea of religion and the state, which has permeated our culture in this United States, particularly in the last 50 years or so. That misunderstanding was not present 100 or 150 or certainly 200 years ago. Indeed, it is epitomized by a line that is in the book in which a chaplain has been talking to the commander of his unit and has suggested that they provide indirect support to an NGO which has been addressing from a religious standpoint the same challenges that the military unit has been dealing with. And the chaplain said, I have been told repeatedly by members of the staff that they are prohibited from providing support or even interacting with any organization that has religion attached to it. Well, nothing is farther from the truth. We have in this country, in many of our federal departments, a total misunderstanding of what this concept of separation of church and state really is. As a matter of fact, separation of church and state is nowhere found in the Constitution. The Constitution says in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law establishing religion or interfering or infringing upon the free exercise of religion. That's a paraphrase, not an exact quote, but the idea is that it has two parts. That government is to not in any way prefer one religion over another, or as particularly was the case when this was established, create a national church. And it's interesting to note why that, one of the reasons why that provision was put into the Constitution, and that was most of the states at that time, or many of them at least, had state churches, and they didn't want a competition from the national government. But in any event, the idea was that the federal government was not to establish a religion, and inherent in that concept that it would not prefer one religious denomination over another. But nowhere in that idea, nowhere in the concept, and nowhere in any of the expositions of the people who voted for that amendment was the idea that the government should be hostile to religion or exclude religion from its activities. And so that is why we have had this misunderstanding. Now, to be quite honest with you, the courts themselves have contributed to that misunderstanding over the years. But it seems to me that that's a very important point that is made very excellently in this book about what the proper relationship is, and that there is no prohibition against military units, political organizations, State Department, or others from properly using religion and having religion as a means of both understanding the people with whom we are dealing, as well as providing a bridge between peoples. Because in many parts of the world, and really when you look at it in our own history, religion is one of the most fundamental concepts which have to do with people's beliefs, which have to do with the way in which people engage each other, and certainly even how they relate to the state, and the state in turn engages other states and other peoples. And so I would suggest to you that in Doug's book, in addition to all the other very important things which we've already talked about and which you'll learn more about when you read the book, that one of the most important contributions is an accurate depiction of what the proper relationship between the state and religion actually is under our Constitution, and that this is something that will not only be helpful in terms of our dealing with the challenge of terrorism, in our relationships with other peoples, in the success of our people who are on the ground trying to find person-to-person rapport, but also can be a very good model for the entire government to rediscover what the founders had in mind back in 1789 when this particular amendment was passed, and how that can be brought up to date in a way which will permeate the entire government and be a salutary improvement in the way in which we understand the relationship of religion to our government. Thank you.
The Reverend Dr. David McAllister Wilson is president of Wesley Theological Seminary. And as president, the Reverend McAllister Wilson has been instrumental in revitalizing the mainline Protestant church, helping to encourage men and women to consider God's call to ministry and preparing them for leadership. Before becoming president in 2002, he was part of a team that made Wesley one of the nation's largest and leading theological schools, preparing approximately 1,300 men and women for ministry each year. In addition, he helped establish the G. Douglas Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley and co-authored the book, Christian Reflections on the Leadership Challenge. We are very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. David McAllister Wilson to the National Press Club.
Doug mentioned the rational actor model. I stand here, I guess, representing the irrational world. And on behalf of that world, I want to thank Doug for this book, because it gives voice to a longing that I hear expressed by many people who live and work in and around this beltway, who want to find ways in which their faith might be correlated with their work in the service of the country. One of those individuals came to me soon after 9/11 and asked if he could bring some of his co-workers over and if we could assemble a group of faculty members at the seminary to help him think through a problem. He worked at the Central Intelligence Agency. And at the agency, his working group worked on models for predicting the stability or instability of various regions. And he said, we want to talk with you because we have not included religion in our model. So they came over in a van with the CIO logo on the side. This was not a covert operation. And we had an interesting day of conversation in which I discovered that actually religion was a factor in this model. What was missing was faith. Religion was in the category of culture, I suppose, with sports and fashion. But what was not there was faith. And near the end of the day, I asked, why do you think it is, you very bright people, you had not included this in your model? And they said, you know, we talked about this in the van on the way over. And at first we thought it was the issue of the separation of church and state. But then we realized that was probably not it. That's the veneer that covered the real reluctance. And I said, well, what's the real reluctance? And they said, we unconsciously were avoiding talking about such a subjective thing as faith because we might have to talk about our own faiths. This book covers both the category of religion, things like what's the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, but more deeply, it deals with the question of what does it feel like to be a Shia or a Sunni, and why would that matter? The book of Hebrews says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Well, what would faith have to do with your worldview, with how you interacted in the public square? Indeed, what are you willing to die for? The specific recommendations of this book are many and interesting, but they're beyond my ability to evaluate on a technical level. Instead, I think the examples you find in this book, examples from Algeria, from the Sudan, from Iraq, and most especially Pakistan, help us have a picture for what organic suasion would look like and feel like. And they're mostly convincing because Doug is himself bilingual. He speaks the language of the defense and intelligence establishment, but he also speaks the language of faith as a practicing Christian. So let me add my word of thanks to Doug for this remarkable book.
Doug, let me just give a general thanks to all of the speakers so far, and to you, Doug. And to you, Doug, for putting together what we call truly a very distinguished panel. And now it's my honor to ask our very distinguished journalist colleague, Sally Quinn, to moderate the panel discussion.
Well, this has been really fascinating. You guys are singing my song. And I come from the elite liberal secular media, and we're not called that for nothing. And it's taken me 5 years of doing On Faith to really get people's attention, but we're now up there among the top 3 or 4 features on the whole Washington Post website. I'm really pleased about that. We're growing all the time. I started the website, I backed into it. I actually happen to be an atheist 5 years ago. I'm not an atheist anymore, but I backed into it because I felt as a journalist that we weren't covering religion, that it was a huge issue that we were just pretending wasn't there, not only in national politics but foreign policy. And I kept writing memos, and I couldn't get anyone to pay attention. So finally, I had lunch with Don Graham, and I said, who owns the Washington Post, and I said, I'm so frustrated, we're not covering the story. And he said, well, why don't you start a website? And I said, but Don, I don't know anything about religion, and I don't know anything about the internet. I could barely do email. And he said, look, nobody's perfect, do it. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do it. And I did. You know, when I look back on it, and I was telling Doug this on the phone the other day, my first sort of moment where I began to realize that this was an issue was when I first started the Washington Post 42 years ago. It was the year of the Shah of Iran's, the 2500th anniversary of Iran and Persia. And the Shah and the Shah Banu had this huge party. And so I was sent over, I'd been at the Post 3 months or something, and I was sent over as I was a party reporter, I was a social reporter. And I met a few journalists in Tehran. We were going down to Shiraz for the party, and one night they said, we want to take you to a secret meeting, but we have to blindfold you. So they blindfolded me, they put me in a car, they took me to this meeting. There were all these young journalists and young Persians, and they were all saying, the Shah is going to be overthrown. And, you know, I was not blindfolded. And the reason was, they said, because he has gone against the religion of this country, and he's going to be overthrown by the religious leaders of this country. So the next day, the chief foreign correspondent for the Washington Post breezed into Tehran, and I said, guess what? There's going to be a revolution, and the religious people are going to overthrow the Shah. And he said, there, dear, you just cover your parties. And I'll do the foreign policy reporting. And of course, we all know what happened. And my brother, who had gotten his PhD in religion at the University of Chicago, said to me when I came back and told him this, he said, the worst thing, the biggest detriment we have in our foreign policy in this country is that nobody in the State Department, nobody in the government is paying attention to religion, and it is what motivates 95% of the people in this world. And the other night, but 2 nights in a row, I went to National Cathedral where Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright, and Jim Baker were all speaking, and all of them about foreign policy. All of them were talking about religion and how important it was as Secretary of State to understand religion. And the next day I went to the State Department where Hillary Clinton and Henry Kissinger were talking about it, how important it was that we understand religion. Madeleine actually wrote a book about it. So my question to you all, and we'll just start over here, is, so there are 5 secretaries of state right there talking about it. You all are talking about it. Why is this such a problem? I know that you've addressed this, and Ed, you addressed it, you know, but everybody seems to understand that we don't get it, that we went into Iraq not really understanding the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, you know, that what's going on right now in the Middle East. In Libya, the religion is different from the religion in Tunisia, which is different from Egypt, which is different from Yemen, which is different from Saudi Arabia, which is different from Syria, you know, Iran. They're all really different. And everybody says, oh, Arabs, Muslims, they're all the same. Why don't we get it? Jim?
Well, I would offer 3 reasons. One is very simply that it's hard. It's not something that we naturally come to in this country. Whether this is a religious country, it's true, but we tend to analyze things, especially foreign policy, in terms, in non-religious terms. Second, it begins at the top. And unless leadership, and I mean the president, the Secretary of State, decide that this is a high priority, then I don't think it's going to happen. It doesn't permeate the organization. And then finally, the State Department, and it's not just the State Department, but the State Department is not constructed to address issues of religion. And you know, Doug offers some interesting, very provocative ideas along those lines. You know, there is an Office of Religious Freedom in the State Department. I think President Bush and President Obama following him, but certainly President Bush introduced the concept that you could of using very religiously motivated non-governmental organizations to achieve very important ends, at least as far as development is concerned or health is concerned. But I still don't think that in foreign policy itself there's a broad understanding, and that's why I think this book is important.
Well, I would echo what Jim has said, but I would also give some credit to the fact that at the people level, things are starting to happen. In the State Department now for 2 years, there's been an informal working group called Religion and Global Affairs. They meet weekly. They invite people like myself to come in and speak. It's very well attended. And as of this last year, there is an informal working group by the same name at the National Security Council. Emphasis is on informal, so it's going to take a while before that starts to influence policy. But the institution itself, the State Department, is still tightly bound in its straitjacket of dogmatic secularism. It's almost as though to get in a high position, you need to have created a learned repugnance to dealing with anything to do with spiritual or religious in nature. And it's just, it really floors me because, you know, when, as you mentioned, 84% of the world's population derives their reason for being from religion. For us to just arbitrarily sweep it off the table is so self-defeating. You know, it's something that's difficult to explain. I think what Jim said is true, but it will need to come from the top. That's when it will be taken seriously. Letters to ambassadors, appointment letters, should emphasize this aspect.
David?
All of those reasons, and I think because it's personal, or it's perceived that way in America. Religion is a private matter, a personal matter, and it's something you avoid in mixed company. That's, I think, the default position of many people. Also because we don't know much about it. Surveys of people who claim they are actively Christian can't say much about the Bible, let alone any other faith. And so it's personal, and we're reluctant to engage with others for fear of getting into territory that's going to be uncomfortable.
Ed?
I agree with my colleagues. I think it's partially our own habit in this country of compartmentalization, which Doug mentioned earlier. And we compartmentalize religion, and that's not the same as thinking about foreign policy. And also, I don't think that we equate religion as a general topic as something that we need to understand about other people. Religion is a private matter for most people, but also our religion is the right one, and we know it's right, and so we don't consider that in the same terms as we think about other people having their religion. So I think it's this gulf that is particularly important as keeping us from doing the kinds of things that Doug is talking about in the book.
Years before I started On Faith, I did a piece on religion in Washington just because I was kind of curious about a subject that there are all these churches and synagogues and temples and yet nobody ever talked about it. So I was talking to Bill Tully, who was here. It was he's now in New York, but he was here at St. Columbus, and so he said, well, you know, I occasionally will go to dinner parties and I wear my collar. And he said, when I wear my collar, no one talks to me. Right. People run the other way. And he said, so one night I just decided I would do something different. So I just wore a coat and tie. And when people asked me what I did, I told them I was a private detective. And he said, I was immediately surrounded by people who wanted to know. So I interviewed one of the great hostesses of Washington, Susan Mary Alsop, whose husband, Joe Alsop, was a columnist. And I asked her about religion. She said, oh, darling, she said, no one ever discusses religion in Washington. It is simply not done. You know? And it was true. The whole idea about religion was, well, you know, the politicians, because those people out there are religious, and the politicians have to get elected, so when they go out of Washington, they have to do some of these unpleasant things like talk about religion, but we sort of don't want to know about it, and we don't discuss it. And that's really the way it was, and still is. And I have to say, around the newsroom, well, when I started doing this website, I find people come up to me all the time now and sort of get me off in the corner and talk to me about their faith. It's really interesting. And I suddenly, because I've gone to a lot of different religious, different services, all over Washington. And I run into some of my really close friends. I didn't even know what religion they were. I didn't know whether they were religious at all. So it's been a real eye-opener, and we, around the Washington Post too, I know everybody's religion in that newsroom, and most people don't even have a clue whether they're religious or not. We had a guy who was head of the technology for Washington Post, and just suddenly, I happened to know because he confided in me several years ago that he was a Mormon, but he didn't want to tell anybody. And he left, he quit the Washington Post 2 months ago to go take over the entire Mormon church website, the Church of Latter-day Saints, which is a huge, huge job. And everybody said, Roger is going to do it. Is he a Mormon? So, you know, I think what you all say is exactly right. That the personal part of it is an issue. So let me say, I mean, you all have come up with some suggestions, but let me put it to you a little bit more specifically, and we'll start with Ed this time. You're President of the United States. What do you do? What do you do? What was the first big thing? Do you appoint a religion czar? I mean, what do you do?
You know, I think that would be exactly the wrong thing to do. The one thing you have to say about religion, and we've all talked about it being personal, it's not something you can impose top down. But I think the first thing you do is you talk with your cabinet and you talk with your military leaders and others and have a frank discussion about how do you inject, if you will, a proper approach to religion as a public servant and get their ideas. And I would bring in a few members of the clergy as well, but I wouldn't create a situation where the clergy is telling other people how to do it. I think this has to come from people themselves figuring out how do you solve this problem. Leaders solve problems every day. The first thing is recognition that there is a problem. The second thing is to look at what your objective is. In other words, what do you really want to accomplish by this? And the third thing then is to look at various options of how you might do this. And I think that this is something that could happen, but as I think Jim or mentioned, it all comes from the top. And so if the president is really interested, you'd be surprised how many people lower down in the governmental structure will also suddenly be interested.
Well, and yet, you know, President Obama, probably one of the most effective speeches he ever made was before he was elected president. He made it to the Sojourners Convention, talking about pluralism. It was sort of a groundbreaking speech. And, you know, he has this faith-based office here run by Joshua Dubois, who I actually had lunch with today. And we were talking about this very issue. You know, clearly he had a prayer breakfast for Easter. He goes to the National Prayer Breakfast. It's clear that this is an issue. I mean, he talked about it during the campaign when the Reverend Wright issue came up. He gave a speech in Cairo about Islam. He's really addressed it in a way that so many other presidents have not, sort of head on. What more do you do? I mean, you can get all the gang together and say, you know, let's talk about this. But if you're really the leader, what action do you do? Ed, do you want to answer that,
Yeah.
or
well, I'll just
or
answer
David?
it briefly. I think you talk with your leaders, and one of the things that most people don't realize is that the most religious part of the federal government is the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. These are people for whom religion is very real because what happens next in their existence is a very real thing also. When I visited troops considerably during the time I was in the government, I went to various prayer breakfasts, and there were colonels and captains and commanders of units, but also you had sergeants major and first sergeants and other people, the people who were in close contact with the men and women in the ranks. And there was an understanding of religion there, and so I think it's not that hard to, it's not just giving speeches, but it's really talking with people and finding out from people who are in the ranks, if you will, is how do we do this? And this would include ambassadors, but also other people in the State Department. It really is like handle any other challenge, and that is you figure out a plan of what you're going to do, and then you put the leadership clout, if you will, behind it. And I think that's the way you do it. And you don't try to do it overnight, try to do everything overnight, but just a start, for example, in taking this book, if you will, and getting some of your cabinet, for example, to let's get together and discuss the things, and what does Doug say that makes sense, what it doesn't make sense, and get them to have a group of people and on down through the organization. We did this in the Justice Department, for example. We used to have seminars on some of these subjects, including the separation of church and state. We had it on Saturday, so nobody could say it was interfering with their work during the week. But it's amazing how much...
Did you pray first?
We did not. No, we didn't go quite that far. But it's interesting how much people will get involved in these somewhat intellectual subjects outside the normal path of work, if they're actually given that opportunity.
We're dealing with a group of military chaplains now at the seminary in a doctor of ministry program, and talking with them, I realized one of the issues that has to be overcome, and that is the role that most religious leaders are relegated to, and that's chaplain. The chaplains have been given a new opportunity and a directive by the Joint Chiefs to be involved both on the ground and with their commanders in advising on religion. They feel unprepared for that task. And they also aren't sure they're going to be asked to perform it. They're looked upon as chaplains, as spiritual leaders of a congregation, and they're called in for that role. Before that man from the CIA called me, the day after 9/11, I got a call from the White House asking if we could send someone over to help in the aftermath of the crisis. Well, the help they were looking for was a chaplain. Mm-hmm. Which is a role we fall into very well. We aren't as accustomed to talking outside of our circles to others about these larger issues of policy.
In direct response to your question, if I were a president, I would call in my Secretary of State and I would tell him or her that I want us to incorporate religious considerations into our practice of foreign policy. And in so doing, I want you, every appointment letter for every ambassador to emphasize this, and I want you to convey this to all of your people. It's not that they need to be religious. They just need to be informed about how to deal with religion. And we supposedly practice realpolitik in this country. Well, I ask you, what is a more honest definition of realpolitik? A vision that sees the world complete and whole, or one that's arbitrarily constrained by dogmatic secularism? And so I would just take leadership on that level in a very pragmatic way and start pushing. And as Ed says, you can't do it overnight. It takes a while.
You did, you sort of narrowed your focus to the military. I'm an Army brat, so I know what you're talking about. But did you want to go a little bit further than the military?
Well, I think when religious leaders are called in by the White House or for others, it's to offer a prayer or to act as chaplain. The question is, how can those in the theological academy, how can practicing spiritual leaders of all faiths be engaged in some of the bigger issues and to be able to talk intelligibly with those who are dealing with foreign policy? I think many of them are prepared to do that, but that's not the role we're seen in usually.
Jim?
I think it's one thing for presidents and other officials to talk about the importance of religion, and that's I'm all in favor of that. But I think even more important would be to elevate people who can talk about religion with real authority, talk about faith with real authority, into important roles in the government. We don't really have that now. You know, I think what's going on in Muslim communities around the world is a dual struggle. One is a struggle for freedom between autocrats and people who want freedom and deserve freedom. And we're seeing that played out in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. And the other is a struggle that involves a small group, that bloodthirsty group, intolerant group that's trying to take over a great religion. Well, in this second area, I can tell you that we have a hard time speaking with authority about that conflict. It's hard to think of someone in government who could speak about that conflict and be respected in Muslim communities around the world. And so I think we need people like that. Now, they could be ambassadors. I mean, why not have the ambassador to, I don't know, Egypt or Saudi Arabia be somebody who's a religious figure and not only understands faith from a Christian or Jewish point of view, but also Muslim faith. And we just don't have that right now.
Jim Wolfenson, who was head of the World Bank and also did a lot of conflict resolution in the Middle East, said, and he's Jewish, and said that he would meet with these Arab leaders and that they would have such respect for each other because the Arab leaders would not look at him as a Jew, but as another person of faith, and that they would immediately bond on that level, which was very helpful to him. But I'm just wondering specifically, several years ago, I was invited to come up to Harvard. They had an On Faith Day, which I was really happy about, and there are 39 chaplains at Harvard. And one of their major complaints is that there's no religion major at Harvard. And that you can't, if you want to study religion, you have to go to the Harvard Divinity School, and a lot of the kids there don't want to because it's a master's and they're afraid they won't get great grades. And there's no religion department. And I was so stunned by that because I thought, how can you be really educated and informed if you don't understand religion? How can you study history and not understand religion? How can you study art or music or philosophy or English or anything and not understand religion? And so I think most people wouldn't send foreign service officers off to assignments without some sort of language. I mean, they send them to language school. And so you would think that there would be some kind of requirement to understand the religion of the country. I mean, certainly they have to study the economics of the country and the politics of the country. Would you be in favor of doing something like that, having a requirement?
Yes, and actually there is some of that. Mm-hmm. There is some of that right now. What I would be in favor of is kind of deeper knowledge and real authority. Now, I don't think you can expect that from every foreign service officer, but I do think you can expect it from a few people who can have a real impact. We're not, the United States is not in the conversation about the second conflict that I was talking about. I mean, we have no standing to discuss Islam in those terms. And why not? There are Americans who should have that, who in fact do have that standing, but they're not part of the governmental apparatus, and I think they ought to be part of it.
Doug, what do you think about the idea of the sort of requirements for foreign service officers?
Well, I would very much agree with what you're saying, and as Jim mentioned, there are some requirements right now. But it's probably it's inadequate, and one of the things we address in the book is what really is needed. And as one of the deans over at one of the local colleges once mentioned, he says, a lot of people, our students, understand the difference between religion. What they don't understand is the power of faith to move to action, and that's so very important. If I had my way, if I were king for a day, I would mandate that every high school in America teach a course, a required course on comparative religions, just so we can understand what the world's about.
That's a whole other panel.
That is. Sorry about that.
David, how do you feel about the requirements for Foreign Service officers or for public figures?
Well, if you started it from scratch, you'd be surprised that Foreign Service officers didn't have some fairly intense education in comparative religions, easily as important as the other things that they study. But that's what I encounter as I meet some of these folks in church on Sunday morning, that they haven't had that training. And I think it would be exciting. It would also be a little dangerous because it would raise all of the issues of private religion, of church and state, and all the things that would bubble up. But I think it would be a wonderful exercise for this country to start talking about these openly and not just in the explosive moments during presidential elections.
Ed?
You know, a part of it, I think, is again, leadership. And if you have people who kind of set the pace and they are interested in this and they're doing this, I'm talking about at the command level, not at the top level necessarily, you're going to find a lot of people. One of the most interesting things about this that I was thinking of is the movie Patton, which I consider one of the best leadership things. And you remember in that movie when they had these ladies from the Sunday school group or something were going there through Patton's quarters, and they see a Bible on the table next to his bed, and they said, "General, do you really read the Bible?" And he says, "Every blankety-blank day." Now, if that was known to the soldiers, there would be a lot of people reading Bibles.
Okay, we have like, do we have time for one more quick question? Okay, what, we really don't have much time for long answers, but what, if you had to say what was the one religious issue or place or religion in the world globally that you think is probably the most dangerous or potentially explosive, what would you say, Ed, right now? I mean, one area that you think...
I think it is the lack of understanding of the Muslim religion and the debate in our country over whether it is fundamentally an evil religion per se, or whether there are, to use the vernacular, good Muslims and bad Muslims. And I think that is at the root of a lot of this misunderstanding, and some way of figuring that out would be at least a starting point.
David?
That, of course, more globally, maybe I'd identify the fundamentalism that is born of fear and the reactivity one finds, not just with regard to Islam, but Hinduism in many quarters, Buddhism, Christianity, the competing fundamentalisms.
Yeah, I totally agree, but I also think that it's important to understand history and to really comprehend how over time, you know, Islam had its heyday. It was a superpower for a long time, and then when they lost Spain in 1492, and then there was a continual eastward shrinking, and then following the fall of the caliphate and all the rest, colonialism, they have been backed into a corner to where they feel inherently defensive, and they're lashing out. That's what you do when you're backed in a corner. And Christians, on the other hand, started out very insecure by this new theology that was conquering all the lands and all. But over time, we have never had confidence that Muslims were other than hostile and a threat to our being. So we've never fully accepted Islam. So a lot of education on both sides has to take place, but it has to be done within context to understand what the psychological dynamics are. A lot of conflicts in the world are attributed to religion, and they have absolutely nothing to do with religion. They're about power politics and the distribution of resources. Religion becomes a mobilizing vehicle, a badge of identity, but it's not the cause.
Mm-hmm. Jim?
I always find it hard to add to anything that Doug says. So I endorse that. The only thing I would urge people is, though, that, that we not focus too much on our own behavior. Yes, we need deeper understanding, absolutely. We can't be successful in foreign policy unless we have the kind of understanding that Doug has talked about. I think in general Americans are quite tolerant. But I do think it's on the understanding part. There is this massive and historic battle that's going on right now, and we're certainly part of it. We can't ignore it. We lost 3,000 people on 9/11 as a result of it, but it really involves Islam itself, and I think we need a much better understanding of that. And I don't think we have that right now. You know, there are somewhere between a billion and 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. We don't even know the exact number, but that's a big number. And they are involved in the throes of a conflict that's, you know, similar to the Reformation. It's a very important conflict, and we need a deeper understanding of it if we're going to succeed in foreign policy.
Well, I think we should give a big hand to our 4 new on-faith columnists.
And if I could ask Sally, I don't know if there was anybody in this room before tonight who hasn't been reading On Faith, but I'm sure you've picked up many converts to On Faith tonight and will be reading it, and we thank you deeply for moderating. We allow time in the program for some questions and answers, some questions from the audience, and let's, if the panelists don't mind, why don't we set a limit of, I don't know, 10 minutes, and then I just, in case any of you were about to leave, in appreciation to all of you for coming, Doug has arranged for the book to be available for sale tonight at a special author's discount. It normally sells for $50. Tonight it'll be only $35, which is, I think, basically the cost to him, and he's passing that on at cost, and you'll get a bonus, which is you personally meet Doug and have your book autographed by him. But let's take, say, 3-4 questions, short questions, no speeches. Yes, Arshad. I think it's Arshad. Yes. Yes.
Excuse me. Thank you. My name is Arshad Mahmood, and I'm a journalist, and I'm a committee member which is hosting this program tonight.
From Bangladesh.
I'm from Bangladesh, a large Muslim majority country. I actually have some personal experience about dealing with American diplomats on these issues for a long, long time. And I think the problem is not that they are not informed or, you know, they can't explain. I think the problem is their arrogance. And, you know, they just go to any country and pretend that they know everything. And you must listen to them what they say. I think this is the biggest problem with the American diplomats.
Arshad, my friend, your question?
The question is, do you think unless and until this perception of the United States being a kind of an anti-Islamist, unless it changes, nothing can work, whatever policies the government takes. Thank you.
Actually, I'd like to comment on that because I spent a lot of my time fighting that notion, and I was actually quite surprised to hear President Obama the other night say that this notion that the United States is trying to destroy Islam is dissipating. I don't think there's much evidence that it is, although I certainly have an open mind. If it is, that's great. This is a very pernicious narrative. It's completely untrue, but it's very, very powerful. And in my opinion, the way to fight a pernicious narrative like that is not to say, you're wrong, look what we did in Bosnia, look, we have more than 2,000 mosques in the United States, people, you know. It's fine to say that, but ultimately, when people begin to view the world through the prism of the West destroying Islam, it's not very effective. And that's why, in my view, the better way to approach this is through a deeper understanding, a kind of counter-narrative that involves what I was talking about before, these struggles that are going on within Islam. That's the true story of what's going on in the world today. There's a struggle for democracy. You know, freedom is universal. Arabs, Muslims deserve freedom as much as everybody else does, and they want freedom. And we're seeing that played out. And then the other struggle is the struggle to try to capture a great religion. I think that's a more powerful narrative. But you put your finger on a big problem, and I don't think it can be fought so easily in kind of a direct way.
Yes.
The other issue you put your finger on is the question of arrogance. And I'd have to say, I'm going to approach this from the standpoint of Christian virtue. I think one of the foremost Christian virtues is humility. And I'd like to see a lot more humility in the American public voice.
Arshad, I thank you for, I call on you first because you always have a very good thought-provoking question. I thank you. Hugh.
My name is Hugh Grindstaff. Sally, your column is on faith. But yet, when you see someone like Terry Jones getting plastered all over all the news networks, but yet you don't see any kind of multi-religious gathering being publicized as much. How do we ever get past that type of thing when you have someone like Terry Jones bring the Quran who gets all the coverage?
Well, you know, that was a really interesting issue, Terry Jones. And at first, the press didn't cover it. And then it sort of leaked out. The local press picked it up, and then it was in one of the New York papers, and then suddenly it sort of snowballed into this big thing. I mean, the guy had 20 followers. I mean, he was a complete nutcase. But once something gets in the press, and then it gets on, because we now have to deal with the internet, it went completely crazy on the internet. So it then becomes a story, the story itself becomes a story. The story of the story becomes a story, and then you can't ignore it. But you will notice that after he did burn the Quran, there was very little mention of it. I mean, we didn't write about it. We deliberately decided not to write about it because people didn't want to foster, and the story leaked out, and 13 people got killed because of it. But these things are, I mean, it's like sex scandals. I mean, we don't necessarily go after sex scandals, but once they break and once they're all over the internet and once everybody's writing and talking about them, then it becomes part of the news and it becomes a story and it's hard to ignore. So, I mean, it's always a kind of question that we're dealing with every single day, not just about religion, but about many other issues as well.
Doug, could I call on you, please?
One of the things that's been mentioned here is this difficult polarization that we have with respect to Islam and Christianity. And if you ever listen to any of the nightly talk shows, the poison and venom that comes out of some of these right-wing commentators that just knock your socks off. And I think that in terms of what practically can all of us do to try to turn that around, well, the recommendation I have is, talk to your pastor about urging him to establish a relationship with the imam of the nearest mosque. And if he's willing to do that and work on him, get him to do it. And what you find is when that happens, you eventually get to the point where they have social gatherings together, and then you have congregants of each going to the other's place of worship. And the ultimate is when the imam comes and preaches a sermon in the church, and the pastor preaches a sermon in the mosque. And then you find that the whole attitude toward Muslims and the rest of it it's amazing when you look at the percentages of those who know a Muslim and what they think about Islam versus those who do not. It's dramatic. So we need to make the effort, and we can do it. We're up to it.
I just add to that. Not all behavior is acceptable, even if it's based on a particular religious view. And the fact that Terry Jones did what he did was terrible, of course, but the fact that people are murdered as a result of it is also terrible. And I think that we're never going to get anywhere in what we want to achieve in foreign policy if more Muslims don't adopt the kind of critical thinking and tolerance that is being taught in madrasas as a result of the work that Doug is doing. You saw in that video discussion that Ozzy was leading about critical thinking. And so what you want is that when an event like this Terry Jones thing happens, and you cannot avoid it. We live in a big country. There are 300 million people. There's crazy people going to do stuff, and whether the conventional press covers it or not, it's going to get out. But what you want is to have the people who view it say, you know, that's kind of a nut who's doing that. Let's put it in some kind of context. Absolutely fine to be outraged about it, but not to kill people or burn down buildings or that sort of thing. So,
well, you know, the other thing about the Terry Jones case was that then once the story got out that he'd actually burned the Koran and it got out on the internet, it was sort of ignored for a while, and then somebody picked it up, and then some of the Muslim leaders in those countries, Karzai particularly, started inciting people about it, and then you get these young Muslims out there, they don't even know what they're talking about. You know, they've burned the Quran, we're going to kill everybody. They walk in and kill 13, were they UN people? Killed 13 people. And the irony of this is that their own people are going and blowing up, they're blowing up mosques that are filled with Korans. They're destroying their own Korans, their own people, and not one person is marching in the streets. I think a lot of it has to do with politics, the political leaders inciting them, and it has nothing to do with religion. It has all to do with politics.
Yes, in the second row there. Mm-hmm.
If I heard you correctly, you were saying that in your conversations with these leaders, you focus heavily on human rights, but at the same time without touching on core religious beliefs, which seems to make sense, particularly in initial context. But then there seems to be another prong missing still when you have so many problems with core beliefs like with a super race, that's a core belief, or God's chosen people, or a special destiny as a core belief leading to seeing the other people as of a lower order, become treated like animals, and then naturally with this disrespect and with the inhuman treatment, naturally you get protests, you get wars, you get series of wars, and it's because of a core belief. How can you deal with these core beliefs that are so destructive?
Well, as I mentioned, and you pointed out, we don't deal with the core beliefs in that sense of the word, but what we do is when we go into these discussions and are deep discussions about human rights and religious tolerance, we ground them in Islamic principles. We go back to their scripture and we show exactly how that is so supportive. And that's why you have this terrorist commander saying, for the first time in my life, I have sensed the soul of the Holy Quran. Now here's somebody who's been studying and teaching it for 26 years, you know, and yet he can be changed if he's able to see, you know, in a context in which religious legitimacy trumps all. The best antidote for religious ignorance is religious understanding. And it's there in all of our sacred texts. All of these world religions are about neighborly concern and the betterment of humanity. And we need to hold our religious leaders accountable for that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. It's a hard one to, yes, go ahead.
Good evening. My name is James Patton. I'm actually with the State Department, and I actually hold a master's in divinity. So when I hear you all talking about elevating faith and elevating individuals to high levels in the government based on their faith, how do you quiet the very real fears that that won't be a vehicle for belief and doctrine of leaders that come in to the government to push their doctrinal convictions, which oftentimes include proselytizing and other things, onto non-believers or other different believers?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a concern, but there's an analogy, let's say, with political beliefs. I mean, you can have someone who's a State Department official who understands politics and policy deeply, but if that person is out pushing his own or her own political line, and that may happen, that's a dereliction of duty. So what I'm talking about is someone who can speak about religion and faith with authority, that it's something in which he or she is really steeped and understand, as it sounds like you are with your degree. I think that's what we need. But it's a concern that somebody's going to be out there proselytizing or trying to change somebody's religion. But it's always there, that kind of concern.
You had a little bit of that at the Air Force Academy when people were trying to start proselytizing, and the blowback was pretty significant, to the point where there's a change in leadership and all sorts of things.
It's still going on, too.
Well, certainly not like it was.
No, but still.
I think the answer was given here in the discussion earlier with the two concepts. One is humility, and the other is respect for others. And I think that's really the antidote.
Wow, the Press Club is, I think, 104 years old. I've been a member since 2004 when I returned from a career abroad for AP, and I can't recall a more memorable, thought-provoking, intellectually stimulating night than this event. And once again, I'm very grateful to Doug, to the entire panel, and to Sally, and mostly to all of you for coming. I think it's a great tribute to Doug and the panelists that although we've gone nearly a half hour over, in my time standing here, I haven't seen one person leave early. So thank you for coming. Doug is going to be available. I think the other panelists might be for a few minutes if you want to come over and continue the exchange. But as we say at the Press Club, this meeting is adjourned.
for a few moments before we get started with the formal part of the program. First of all, good afternoon. I'm Mark Hamrick. I'm the 104th President of the National Press Club. Today's program will begin in just a few minutes. First of all, a couple of important items to pass along. We'd offer, first of all, hearty greetings to our friends from the leadership of the People's Bank of China. They're attending the lunch as guests of Georgetown's Global Education Institute. Welcome to Washington and the National Press Club today. This is a great time that I would ask for you to please silence any of your cell phones or any other devices that could disrupt the speaker today. A couple of notes on the format. Once the program begins, I'll introduce the head table. As I do that, I'll ask that you withhold your applause until all the head table guests are introduced. And if you have any questions for the speaker, many of you have already begun to funnel them up here. I ask you to write them on the cards of your table and send that up, and I'll ask as many as time permits. Finally, at the end of the program, we'll have some closing announcements. All of our cameras here today, I'd ask that you remain seated so that we don't disrupt any of their work, as well as our live broadcast. And thank you very much. We'll begin shortly. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I got it. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mark Hamrick. I'm a broadcast journalist with the Associated Press, and I'm the 104th President of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, events such as this, while also working to foster a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, I'd ask that you please visit our website at www.press.org. Donate to programs offered to the public through our Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. You can find information on the website there as well. So on behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, as well as those of you attending today's event at our head table. it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity if you happen to hear applause today. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club. That's available for free download on iTunes. You can also follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag #NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have Q&A, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. Now it is time to introduce our head table guests, and I'd ask each of you here to stand up briefly as your name is announced. So we begin from your right. Skip Kaltenheiser, he is a financial news writer, also for the International Bar Association, who went to law school with our guest speaker today. Ron Orrell is a banking reporter with Dow Jones Market Watch. Mark Sheff Jr., reporter for Investment News, and he's also the chair of our NPC Publications Committee. Jennifer Schonberger is a staff writer with Kiplinger's Personal Finance. She's also a new member of the club, and we're thankful for that. Richard Brown is our guest speaker's chief economist. Lorraine Willard is a reporter covering housing and financial services policy for Bloomberg News. Scott Cooper is here, and among the other things that he does, he is husband of our guest speaker. Skip over the podium for a moment. Allison Fitzgerald is vice chair of the NPC Speakers Committee, and she is a reporter for Bloomberg News. Skip over our guest for a moment. Lee Perryman works for the Associated Press, and he's the Speakers Committee member who organized today's event. Did a fantastic job. Thanks so much, Lee. Jose Villarreal is our guest speaker's chief of staff. Welcome. Joe Adler is a reporter for American Banker and Source Media. Tim Almond is editor-in-charge and Washington economics editor for Thomson Reuters. Darren Gersh is bureau chief of the Nightly Business Report. And Jim Parenti is associate dean of Georgetown University. And now you can give your round of applause to our head table guests. Our guest speaker today is the 19th chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Her term ends on July 8th, just 2 weeks from today, and I'm told that this is the last major speech that she will give. We're grateful that she's choosing the National Press Club to do that. She is often described as outspoken, aggressive, forceful, direct, candid, compassionate, optimistic, and realistic, yet generally wary of politics. Appointed by President Bush in 2006, her start at the FDIC was generally uneventful. Then came the financial crisis that pushed her onto center stage. In 2008 and 2009, Forbes magazine named her the second most powerful woman in the world. In 2008, she topped the Wall Street Journal's 50 Women to Watch list. In 2009, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and received the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award and the Hubert H. Humphrey Civil Rights Award. And in 2010, she was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the new sheriffs of Wall Street. She is a Kansas native who grew up in the small town of Independence. Just so happens that's 12 miles up the road from my hometown of Coffeyville. Our high schools were arch rivals in sports and everything else, but that's another story. Our guest speaker worked as a bank teller in college. Later in the 1970s, she was an instructor at the University of Arkansas Law School and staff member, and then the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. In 1981, she was recruited by Senator Bob Dole to work on his Washington staff, where she was deputy counsel and counsel and research director for his presidential campaign. She ended the decade as an attorney with the New York Stock Exchange. In 1990, she ran for a Republican congressional seat in Kansas, but lost by fewer than 1,000 votes, drawing attention during her campaign by riding a bicycle around the district. She served as commissioner and